Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander somewhere cold, quiet, and quietly green. A place where the landscape looks like it was designed by a minimalist with a thing for black rock and fog. You're in Iceland now, barefoot in a dream, though hopefully not literally barefoot because you're walking across lava. But here's the twist. The lava isn't sharp or jagged. It's soft, almost raw plush, covered in thick, bouncy, absurdly quiet moss. It stretches for miles, blanketing volcanic chaos in a layer of fuzzy peace, like someone threw a weighted blanket over the apocalypse. And you're going to learn all about it, slowly, silently, at moss speed. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you're hoping for high-octane science thrills. There are no explosions here, no particle accelerators, just a silent plant that's been very patiently taking over an entire country, one cell at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's falling asleep to the sound of slow-growing botany. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by stepping into a thick Icelandic fog. It hugs the earth, blurs the horizon, deadens sound. Every footstep you take sinks slightly into the moss, spongy, resilient, cool. You're walking across the hardened remains of a lava flow, likely from a volcano that exploded sometime before anyone alive could be blamed for anything. But there's life here. You crouch down, fingertips brushing the moss. It's not grass, it's not lichen. It's not even soft like you expected. It's dense, springy, almost too perfect. A natural carpet rolled out over fields of ancient violence. Moss doesn't shout for attention. It doesn't grow tall or wave in the breeze, it just is. And in Iceland, it is everywhere. Here's your first science fact to chew on. Mosses are bryophytes, a group of non-vascular plants that don't have roots, stems, or flowers. They absorb water and nutrients directly through their leaves, which means they can grow on surfaces where no normal plant dares to try. Like, say, a volcanic wasteland. You walk further into the field, noticing how uniform everything looks. Like a giant hand scooped green frosting over a black cake. The moss here is mostly Rhacomitrium lanuginosum, or woolly fringe moss. And yes, that is probably the most adorable Latin name in science. But don't let the cuteness fool you. This moss is tough. It survives freezing winters, scorching winds, and soil so poor it's barely more than powdered rock. And somehow, without roots, without speed, without drama, it spreads. Scientists still argue whether moss is more a colonizer or a stabilizer. Some say it's the aggressive vanguard of plant succession, the first to claim lava flows and prepare the land for forests. Others insist it's more of a squatter, making the best of a bad space and chilling there indefinitely. Either way, it wins. You find a rock poking up from the moss and sit for a moment. No birds, no cars, just wind and the occasional slurp of your boot shifting in the damp ground. A quirky tidbit: Icelandic law protects moss. It's a national treasure, right up there with glaciers and björk. In fact, damaging moss can get you fined, and if you're a tour guide, possibly fired. There are signs. Do not walk here. Moss takes centuries to recover. That's not an exaggeration. Some of this stuff has been growing since the Crusades. You lie back carefully, very carefully, and let your eyes rest. The fog is lifting now, revealing low hills all wearing the same green sweater. You imagine the lava underneath, still warm in spirit, cooled and forgotten by time. And above it, the silent, tireless plant doing its quiet, determined thing. No noise, no rush, just moss everywhere. You begin to slow down too. Because tonight's science isn't meant to wake you up. It's meant to wrap you up, like a blanket of green. You stand up slowly, careful not to damage the moss beneath you. It's odd, this sense of respect you're starting to develop for something so small, so quiet. The moss doesn't ask for reverence. It doesn't even ask for space. But the more you walk through this Icelandic lava field, the more it feels like you're moving through someone's living room. You whisper without thinking. You place your feet with intent. You become slow. Now that the fog has lifted, the vastness of the lava field becomes clear. It stretches in every direction like a wool blanket unraveled across a broken floor. Beneath that green softness is a world of sharp, twisted volcanic stone. You remember learning somewhere that Iceland is basically still being born, constantly shaped by fire, ice, and the occasional airport gift shop. But long before gift shops and geothermally heated swimming pools, there was lava, endless sheets of it, pouring from craters and volcanoes with names that look like keyboard smashes. When the lava cooled, it left a surface almost impossible to live on. Too hot, too dry, too barren, almost, because moss showed up. And moss did what moss does best, it stayed. Mainstream science moment. Mosses were among the first plants to colonize post-volcanic landscapes in Iceland. After eruptions, when everything else was obliterated, moss moved in. It doesn't need soil, it doesn't need shelter, just a bit of moisture and something vaguely surface-shaped to cling to. Basalt, pumice, old shoes, it's not picky. Over time, moss starts breaking down the lava, tiny acid excretions, bits of trapped water, flakes of decomposing moss itself. Layer by layer, it turns volcanic rock into something resembling soil. And when the moss finally begins to decompose, that's when grasses, flowers, and shrubs get their chance. You're standing on the Pioneer, the slowest, greenest demolition crew in the world. And here's the kicker. It happens so slowly, you'd never notice. You could come back to this exact spot in 20 years, and the moss might have grown an inch. If it's feeling ambitious, you kneel down and watch a single clump of moss. It seems still, lifeless. But if you had a microscope, you'd see tiny leaflets absorbing sunlight, capturing moisture from the air, building cell walls out of thin air and mineral dust. You'd see whole micro-ecosystems, mites, fungi, invisible life, all cradled in the spongy matrix. Quirky tidbit. There's a form of moss in Iceland that's biofluorescent under UV light. It glows a ghostly green in certain caves, giving rise to old stories about elves, spirits, and moss that whispered warnings to those who stepped too loudly. You reach out and touch a patch beside your boot. It's cool and springy, but holds your weight like memory foam. You press a little harder. The moss pushes back gently. You pull away and the mark lingers for just a moment, then vanishes. Like you were never there. It's humbling. You start walking again. This time you head toward the edge of the field where a small stream cuts through the rock. The moss here is even thicker, almost absurdly fluffy, like it's been eating well and sleeping even better. You pause and sip from your canteen. Even though you're not thirsty, the air is clean. The wind hums low. There's a stillness here that seeps into your bones. A kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. It feels earned. Scientists still argue whether moss played a significant role in Iceland's early ecological recovery. Some claim it was essential, forming the first steps of ecological succession. Others argue it's more of a placeholder, delaying real soil development by hogging space and moisture. Honestly, the moss doesn't care. It's too busy winning. You walk along the edge of the stream, watching the water lap gently at moss-covered stones. It looks like green velvet laid over sculpture. You find a large boulder, partially wrapped in moss, and sit. Above you, the sky is finally blue. The kind of blue that feels new, like it hasn't been used in a while. You breathe deeply. There's a peace here you can't quite explain. The moss doesn't move, it doesn't sing, it doesn't even smell like much. But somehow, it calms you. Maybe because it's always been here and always will be. The boulder you're sitting on probably cooled 1,000 years ago. The moss beneath you, maybe 400 years old. Your presence here, a blink. You press your hand gently against the moss beside you, fingers splayed, and you whisper, "Nice work." You don't move for a while, not because you're tired, though the moss does feel suspiciously like a mattress, but because something about this place insists on stillness. The kind of stillness that isn't a lack of motion, but a kind of quiet authority. The moss owns this lava, not loudly, not aggressively, just completely. And the lava seems fine with that. You finally stand up and look around. Everything still appears the same. Same green blanket, same jagged edges hidden beneath. But now that you know the story, it's different. You're not just walking across a landscape. You're walking on a living strategy, a slow-motion invasion, not of weapons or walls, but of structure. You kneel again and pinch off a tiny corner of moss. Don't worry, you're careful. It's like tearing a square from a green sponge, but finer, denser. You hold it up to the light, and what you see is almost absurd. A mess of miniature leaves and stems all layered together in a chaotic, soft clump. Here's your mainstream science fact. Mosses don't have true roots. Instead, they use rhizoids, tiny hair-like structures that anchor them to surfaces but don't absorb nutrients. That's right. Moss is basically just freeloading on the lava, pulling moisture from the air, sunlight from above, and nutrients from rain and dust. It's the ultimate minimalist plant. No plumbing, no flowers, no drama. You gently squeeze the clump in your fingers and feel water ooze out. Not drip, ooze. That's because mosses hold astonishing amounts of water, up to 20 times their dry weight. This isn't just hydration, it's armor. That water shields the moss from freezing, desiccation, and, ironically, lava heat. Not fresh lava, of course. Moss isn't that bold. You drop the clump gently back where it came from. It's like it never left. Scientists still argue whether mosses evolved this water-hoarding ability for themselves, or if it's an accidental side effect of their sponge-like anatomy. Some argue it's a passive feature. Others think it's an active adaptation, an intentional design shaped by millions of years of quietly being stepped on. You take a few more careful steps and notice the variety. Not all mosses look alike here. Some are wiry and tight, hugging the rock like a nervous guest. Others grow in soft domes, practically asking to be mistaken for pillows. One kind grows like tiny green dreadlocks, dangling off a boulder like moss with commitment issues. You crouch and inspect again. And that's when you spot something odd. Beneath one moss cluster, tucked into the damp shade, there's movement. Not dramatic, just a flicker. You blink and lean closer. It's a beetle, jet black, slow-moving, about the size of a fingernail. It's crawling between moss fronds like someone navigating a hedge maze in miniature. You watch as it disappears beneath the green. Gone. And just like that, you realize this isn't moss covering a rock. This is moss covering a universe. A quirky tidbit: Icelandic moss patches often support entire microecosystems. Tiny animals, bacteria, fungi, and even tardigrades. Yes, the famous water bears, who can survive dehydration and outer space. These little guys hang out in moss like it's a five-star hotel, possibly with a lava field view. You sit again and trace your fingers through a patch beside you. It springs back softly, no complaint, like it's used to this. You wonder how many hikers, scientists, sheep, and stray thoughts have passed this way, brushing over it, leaving no trace. You pause, then lie down again, flat on your back, arms spread gently over the moss, eyes to the sky. You don't know why, it just feels right. The moss supports you as it has supported everything else. No protest, no resistance, just accommodation. You listen. You expect silence, but you hear soaking, that soft, ambient fizz of dampness being processed, water shifting between leaves, a sort of living static. And then a breeze moves across the field. The moss flexes, barely, but you feel it, as if the entire surface beneath you just sighed. Scientists still debate how mosses distribute water internally. Some models suggest capillary action between leaflets. Others propose microfluidic networks that change based on humidity and angle. No one fully agrees, but the moss doesn't mind. It just keeps working. You close your eyes. Your heartbeat syncs with the rhythm of wind and moss. You don't know how long you lie there. Time doesn't move the same in places where the protagonist is a plant that grows less than a millimeter a year. Eventually you sit up. There's moss on your jacket. You don't brush it off. You just smile, because now you're part of the system too. You start walking again, this time slower, like the moss has taught you something about pace, about how not everything needs to happen all at once, about how quiet can be a kind of power. The sun is low in the sky now, throwing a warm amber hue across the field. The moss responds in its usual way. Not at all. At least, not that you can see, but you get the sense it's doing something. Somewhere deep inside its spongy surface, photosynthesis is taking place. Reluctantly. Mainstream science break. Mosses perform photosynthesis just like other plants, but they do it with less drama. They have chlorophyll, they absorb sunlight, they convert carbon dioxide into sugars. But because they're non-vascular and often live in nutrient-poor environments, they operate at a much slower metabolic rate. It's like comparing a sloth to a cheetah. If the sloth was also solar-powered and shaped like a bath mat, you find a small rise in the field, just a few feet higher than the rest, and climb it. From here, the view is nearly the same. Endless green waves stretching out in every direction, but now you can see something new. In the distance, near the edge of the moss, is black, bare rock, unclaimed lava. You decide to head toward it. As you walk, the moss begins to thin. It's still present, still clinging, but the patches are smaller. In between, the raw, dark surface of the lava reveals itself, scorched and cracked, still wearing the texture of an eruption that probably startled a few medieval farmers. You crouch near the edge where moss meets rock. It's not a dramatic battle. No front lines. Just a slow, creeping process that's been going on for centuries. The moss encroaches by millimeters each year, advancing like a glacial army with zero morale but infinite patience. And here's where it gets interesting. You lean in and notice that even the bare rock isn't entirely bare. There's a faint dusting, green-gray, almost invisible unless you tilt your head just right. These are moss spores, the beginning of the next wave. You blow gently on the surface, a tiny puff. Nothing moves. But somewhere, a spore just found a crack to settle in. And that's how it begins. Again, scientists still argue whether moss colonization follows predictable patterns or if it's more random. driven by wind, moisture, and luck. Some say moss always targets north-facing surfaces first. Others claim it just follows the cracks in the water. No consensus. The moss offers no comment. You find a particularly bold patch that has taken root, or, well, rhizoid, in a narrow groove between two slabs of lava. It's thriving. You smile. It's like finding a houseplant that refused to die and instead bought the apartment next door. A quirky aside, some researchers in Iceland have given nicknames to particularly resilient moss patches. There's the couch, shaped like a love seat, the marathoner, fastest growing one in the region, and the lump. No one knows why it's shaped like that, but it is, and it's beloved. You continue walking, now tiptoeing through the thinner sections, making sure not to crush anything. You're in sacred territory now, the boundary between what was and what will be. And that's when you find it, a tiny white flag. Well, not an actual flag, but a scientist's marker, a small plastic tag stabbed into the moss with a number on it. You crouch to examine. It's a study plot. This patch of moss is being monitored, measured, loved from a scientific distance. You feel oddly honored to have stumbled into it. There's a laminated tag beside the stake. Plot 14B, Rhacometrium recovery rates, 2004 present. That's right. Someone's been watching the same moss for decades. You sit again, just beside the marker, and imagine the researcher. The years of data, the graphs, the polite scientific papers, all for a plant that barely moves. And yet, you get it. This isn't about speed. It's about persistence. You lie back again, just beside the test plot, careful not to interfere. Overhead, the clouds have started to gather, drifting slowly in from the sea. The light softens. The moss darkens a little, drinking in the air's moisture, preparing for another quiet night. Scientists still don't fully understand how mosses handle extremes, how they survive freezing, desiccation, radiation. Some believe they enter a state of suspended animation. Others think they just don't care. Either way, they bounce back. Given a little light and water, they get right back to growing. You close your eyes for a moment. You think of all the dramatic plant life that hogs the spotlight. Tall redwoods, explosive mushrooms, weird orchids that smell like rotting meat. And then there's moss. Lone, silent, relentless. You open your eyes again and look out over the field. The moss is winning, slowly, softly, and it's not even trying. You're still lying beside the research plot when the first drop of rain hits your cheek. It's cold, not surprising. You're in Iceland after all, but it's not unpleasant. You sit up slowly, blinking into the misty drizzle as it begins to fall across the moss. It doesn't bead up or splash. It's absorbed immediately, greedily, like the moss has been waiting all day for a drink. The sound changes too. The already muted landscape becomes even quieter. Raindrops land like whispers on sponge. No ticking, no plinking, just a delicate, damp hush. You crouch to observe. The moss darkens as it drinks, its bright green dulling to a deep, rich forest hue. You touch it. It's still soft, but cooler now, like a soaked sponge left in a mountain stream. The raindrops roll off your jacket and disappear into the carpet below. Here's your mainstream science moment. Mosses absorb water directly through their leaves. Because they lack a vascular system, no xylem, no phloem, they rely entirely on surface absorption. It's primitive and wildly effective. Rain, fog, dew, even ambient humidity can be captured and stored inside their cells almost instantly. This is what makes moss so good at surviving in Iceland's moody weather. When the sun's out, great, it photosynthesizes. When it rains, Even better, it drinks and stores. When it freezes, it slows down, dries out, and waits. It's like the ultimate introvert. It doesn't complain, it just adjusts. You move along a narrow lava ridge, hopping from one moss-free stone to another, trying not to step on anything living. The drizzle thickens. Visibility drops. You're surrounded by shades of gray and green now. Like you've walked into a black and white film where someone left the saturation dial turned slightly up. And then you spot it. A moss patch so thick and domed, it looks like a green beanbag chair from a minimalist furniture store. You sit down carefully, again, carefully, and let your weight settle in. It doesn't sag, doesn't squish. It holds you like it knew you were coming. You lean back and let the rain do its thing. And that's when the weird part hits you. This moss has no roots, no anchor, no taproot, no system of tiny hairs clinging desperately to the earth. It's just lying there, like a guest who never left, holding on by sheer tenacity and moisture. A quirky tidbit: some Icelandic moss species can detach entirely and roll with the wind to colonize new areas. Yes, tumbleweed style. This isn't common, but it happens. And when it does, the moss carries spores, fragments, and bits of tiny life with it, essentially becoming a roaming green life pod. A mossy Mars rover, except on Earth, and way more polite. You press your palm into the dome. Underneath, it's alive with invisible movement. Microbes, invertebrates, fungi. A whole secret civilization existing a centimeter from your fingertips. And they don't know or care that you're here. You are, to them, just weather. Scientists still argue whether moss is more fungus-like or plant-like in its function. Some characteristics, its spore-based reproduction, its ability to survive desiccation, are eerily fungal. Others, like its chlorophyll use and dependence on light, are plant through and through. It defies categories, straddling the edge of green life with an amused shrug. You look out over the field again and imagine the centuries it took to build what you're seeing. Each moss patch, the result of hundreds of years of slow growth, occasional weather tantrums, and quiet resilience. You wonder if any of the moss here predates the first settlers of Iceland. It's possible. Some mosses grow just 1 millimeter per year. 1 millimeter. If your fingernails grew that slowly, you'd never need clippers. Just a lifetime of patience and maybe a nail file every few decades. You notice something else now. The rocks beneath the moss, previously jagged and sharp, have softened. Not literally, but visually. The moss doesn't just cover, it redefines. What was once violent and broken now looks calm. What erupted in fire now rests beneath silence. The moss isn't hiding the lava, it's healing it. You sit quietly with that thought for a while, just breathing, letting the rain hit your shoulders, letting the moss hold your spine, letting the planet do what it does best when we don't interfere. Eventually, the rain eases. A soft mist remains, curling through the lava ridges like sleepy ghosts. You rise, your jacket damp, but your spirit weirdly dry. You take one last look back at the beanbag moss, and you say thank you, out loud. The moss, of course, says nothing back, but you're pretty sure it heard you anyway. You head downhill now, the moss soft beneath your boots, the air thick with that post-rain smell, somewhere between stone and soil, but cleaner, crisper, almost innocent. And as you descend, the landscape changes. At first, you barely notice. The moss gets patchier, the ground more uneven, and then you reach what looks like a small collapse in the terrain, a depression, a ripple in the land's memory. You step to the edge and peer down. It's a lava tube, An old one, formed centuries ago when a river of molten rock flowed beneath the surface, then cooled and emptied, leaving a long, hollow tunnel underfoot. Time has opened part of the ceiling, revealing a dark passage fringed with green. You hesitate, then step inside. The temperature drops a few degrees instantly. Your breath fogs faintly. The light dims, but there, on the stone walls, glowing faintly in the gloom, is moss. Moss in the dark. You blink, squint, but it's there. Pale green patches clinging to the damp rock, barely visible in the dim light filtering from above. It shouldn't be here. Not really. Plants need light. That's one of the rules. But moss? Moss seems to like bending rules. Mainstream science pause. Some mosses can survive in low light or no light environments by entering dormancy. Others partner with fungi to exchange nutrients, or even adapt by maximizing the little light they do get. Icelandic lava tubes have been found to harbor mosses that grow 1 millimeter every few years, thriving on condensation and mineral leaching alone. You slide further into the tunnel, guided by occasional shafts of sunlight breaking through cracks above. The moss glows softly where it catches light, its version of a spotlight. You run your hand along the stone. It's damp, slick, cold, but the moss is warm, not in temperature exactly, more like presence. It feels alive, even here. A quirky tidbit: in Icelandic folklore, caves and mossy places were thought to house hidden people, or huldufolk. These weren't malevolent beings, just elusive, private, and deeply connected to the land. If moss grew near their cave, it was a sign of protection. Step on that moss, though? Bad idea, very bad. You smile, remembering where you are. You take another step and the ground hums. No, not an actual vibration, just a feeling, a shift, like stepping into a cathedral carved from lava and patience. The moss beneath your foot springs slightly, then resettles. You whisper an apology, just in case. Farther in, you spot a patch of silver moss. That's not poetic, it's real. Certain species shimmer with a metallic hue when wet, their tiny leaf hairs refracting light like frost. You crouch and watch it sparkle in the faint beam cutting through the ceiling. It's like nature's disco ball, turned down to sleep mode. Scientists still argue whether lava tube mosses represent a unique form of adaptation or simply the extreme end of moss normalcy. Some say it's evolution in action, a slow response to isolation. Others claim it's just opportunism. The moss found a microclimate and, as usual, it stayed, unbothered, undisturbed. You rest against the tube wall and feel the slow drip of water from above. A drop lands on your wrist, cold, sharp, but comforting in its rhythm. Drip, pause, drip. The moss drinks without complaint. You wonder how long this patch has been here. Decades, centuries. Some Icelandic moss colonies have been dated to over 900 years old. That's older than Shakespeare, older than the printing press, older than the idea of a weekend. And it's just sitting here, photosynthesizing, barely, surviving completely. You stay a while longer, letting your eyes adjust to the soft light, letting the moss fill your vision. The world narrows to texture and moisture. You feel like you've shrunk, not in a cartoonish way, but in priority. Out there, things are noisy, notifications, deadlines, traffic. In here, it's just moss, rock, and water. The planet doing small things very well. Eventually, you retrace your steps and climb back out into daylight. The contrast stuns you. The sun feels loud now, the sky too open. But the moss doesn't flinch. It waits at the edge of the tube like a doorman, waving you back into the green. You stand there, halfway between two worlds, the deep, damp patience of the lava tube and the wide, windy sprawl of the moss field above. And for a moment, you don't want to choose. But the wind nudges you forward. You walk again, letting the light hit your shoulders, still damp from the tube's breath. You carry the stillness with you. You emerge from the lava tube with a quiet reverence, like stepping out of a chapel made entirely of stone, time, and damp green thoughts. The wind meets you again, tugging softly at your jacket, reminding you that the world above is still moving, even if just barely. You take a few steps, and the moss meets your feet like an old friend. Familiar, forgiving, springing back from the weight, without protest, without memory. It's strange how something so slow can feel so alive. But this isn't a new relationship. Moss and people have known each other for a long time. And in Iceland, that history goes back over 1,000 years. To the arrival of the Vikings, you picture them now. Rough-hewn sails, salted beards, boots caked in ocean spray. You imagine one stepping off a longship onto Icelandic soil, or more accurately, Icelandic moss, sinking an inch or two, muttering in Old Norse something roughly equivalent to, squishy. Mainstream history check. The first permanent Norse settlers arrived in Iceland around 874 AD. The island was largely uninhabited. No towns, no roads, no sheep yet. Just lava, ice, and moss. The moss, of course, wasn't mentioned much in the sagas, but it was there, covering everything, hiding the violence of the land in softness. And soon it was helping. Vikings used moss in shoes to absorb sweat, as a basic wound dressing, as insulation in sod houses, even as primitive diapers for infants. Not glamorous, sure, but practical. And in a landscape with little else to work with, moss became part of daily survival. You walk past a stone outcropping that looks suspiciously like the foundation of an old longhouse. It's likely not. But the imagination fills it in. You picture families huddled against the cold, moss stuffed into the cracks of the turf walls, the smell of wet wool and boiled fish thick in the air. Cozy? Not exactly, but the moss made it bearable. And it wasn't just the Vikings who noticed. A quirky bit of folklore. Icelanders believed certain moss-covered rocks were alive, not in a plant sense, but in a spiritual one. These were the homes of elves, or huldufolk, the hidden people. Disturbing moss on these rocks could bring illness, bad luck, or even landslides. Construction projects were sometimes rerouted to avoid these sacred spots, and still are. Even today, Icelandic road crews occasionally detour around elf rocks, just in case. You pause by a particularly lush mound and wonder who's living underneath it. You don't step on it, not out of superstition, out of respect. Because whether it houses microbes or imaginary beings, this moss has earned its peace. Scientists still argue whether the Norse settlers unknowingly helped spread moss by disturbing soil, introducing grazing animals, or creating man-made structures that trapped moisture. Some believe early settlements created microhabitats that favored moss growth. Others think moss would have spread regardless. Either way, they grew together, human and bryophyte, awkward roommates on a volcanic island. You continue walking and come across something unexpected, a sheep. It blinks at you with mild disapproval. You blink back. Sheep are everywhere in Iceland. And while they may seem out of place in this mossy wilderness, they've been part of the ecosystem for centuries. They graze, they wander, they trample, which unfortunately doesn't go over well with moss. You observe its little hooves delicately pressing into a moss mat, leaving faint craters behind. The moss will take decades to recover. And the sheep? It simply walks on, indifferent to the destruction. You consider explaining the situation, but the sheep is clearly not interested in a lecture. A nearby sign reads, "Please stay on marked paths. Icelandic moss takes centuries to grow." It's both a warning and a plea. And here's the irony. The moss can survive lava, ash, ice, and volcanic gases, but not tourism. One poorly placed footprint, and what took 200 years to grow can be flattened in 2 seconds. You now see those signs differently, not as nags, as memorials. You follow a winding trail that threads between thick moss banks, kept just wide enough for one person to pass. You walk heel to toe, careful not to stray. The trail itself seems alive, flanked by green walls framed by black stone, topped by drifting cloud. And every now and then, you notice things the Vikings might have seen too. A stone circle that could have been a hearth, a flattened patch that might have held a tent, a moss-covered ridge that looks like the spine of a sleeping dragon. You sit again, letting the wind pass over you, letting the moss settle beneath you. And you realize this isn't just a landscape, it's a memory field. Every tuft, every patch, every green hillock is a witness to fire, to footsteps, to centuries. And you right now are part of that memory. Softly, temporarily, but still, you remain seated for a while, nestled between mossy ridges and lava flows, until the light begins to shift again. In Iceland, that can mean many things. The sun isn't setting, not exactly, it's just tilting, drawing longer shadows, softening the colors, making the moss look even more like velvet laid gently over sleeping stone. You decide to follow a narrow trail leading into the hills. The incline is subtle at first, the kind that lulls you into believing it's flat, until your legs start asking questions. But the moss is with you every step, growing thicker here and somehow softer. It muffles your footsteps like nature itself is leaning in, trying to keep you quiet. And you realize something new. The moss isn't alone. There are other plants now, small, shy ones, poking their heads above the green carpet like hesitant party guests. A few dwarf birches, only knee-high, despite being decades old. Tiny Arctic thyme hugging the ground, releasing a faint scent of mint when disturbed. Clusters of lichen, those strange symbiotic mashups of fungi and algae, adding crusty textures to the rock like forgotten graffiti. Mainstream science moment. Moss is often the first step in ecological succession. By slowly breaking down volcanic rock and holding on to water and organic material, moss creates the fragile beginnings of soil. That thin layer allows other life to join the party. Grasses, herbs, shrubs. Over centuries, this can lead to full-blown ecosystems, all because moss made the first move. You sit beside a patch of Arctic willow, just a few inches tall, but technically a tree. It's strange to be surrounded by forest that wouldn't even reach your ankles. But here, that's enough. Height isn't power, survival is. You touch a birch leaf, it's waxy, stiff, resilient. The moss below it is brighter than usual, thriving in the shade, insulated by the slow drift of leaf litter. It's a partnership, quiet, effective, like roommates who never speak, but always wash their dishes. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the moss species in Iceland have been found in deep ice cores, frozen for thousands of years, yet still viable when thawed. Moss isn't just patient, it's persistent, possibly immortal. The deep green version of a cryptic email from a forgotten era. Just checking in, still alive, still growing. You keep climbing, reaching a small plateau where the moss thins out again. Exposed rock peeks through in jagged patterns, like scars beneath a woven bandage. You pause and listen. and realize there's no sound at all. Not quiet, silence. No birds, no water, just wind and breath. It's not unsettling. It's clean. You step forward and notice a faint shimmer ahead. At first you think it's a trick of the light, but then you see it clearly. A thin patch of moss covered in dew, catching the evening sun just right. It glows softly, gently, as if the moss is exhaling light. You crouch, transfixed. Each dew droplet rests inside a tiny cup-shaped leaf, magnifying its edges, turning it into a lens. Thousands of microscopic lenses glittering back at you like a sleepy galaxy. You almost expect to hear chimes. And this is moss photosynthesizing. It's subtle, impossible to see in real time, but it's happening. Energy being captured, sugars being built, carbon being tucked away into little green cells. Scientists still debate how much carbon mosses really store. Some models suggest it's negligible. Others believe mosses play a critical role in regulating Earth's carbon and water cycles, especially in northern latitudes. In permafrost zones, for example, moss acts as insulation, protecting ancient carbon stores from thawing. Without it, we risk unleashing feedback loops that are, well, not very sleepy. You press your hand lightly against the moss again. Cool, resilient, alive. But now you feel something new, the weight of time. Because this patch of moss you're touching, it might have started growing before the printing press, before the compass, before your ancestors had surnames. And it has been doing the same thing ever since. No reinvention, no upgrades, just surviving, softly. You lie down once more, letting the plateau cradle your back, letting your head rest on a moss pillow you hope doesn't mind. You close your eyes and feel the texture beneath you, slightly uneven, slightly damp, slightly perfect. And then you start to drift, not to sleep just yet, but into alignment with the earth, with the rhythm, with the quietest conquest in history, one that didn't shout, didn't march, didn't demand. It just grew. You don't get up right away. The moss is too good at this. It's not trying to keep you down. It's just exceptionally convincing. Like it knows that whatever's waiting for you in the world outside this field can wait a little longer. The moss has waited centuries. What's your rush? As your eyes flutter open again, you notice the fog rolling back in. Not heavy, not cold, just enough to blur the edges of things. You sit up and feel it wrap gently around your shoulders like a second blanket. The kind you don't remember asking for, but suddenly need. You start walking again, slower now, not because you're tired, but because the moss has taught you how to walk. Deliberate, aware, with an occasional pause for no reason at all. And that's when you see it. A small metal sign staked into the moss. Clean, plain, with just a number, 941. You look around. You're standing in the middle of a scientific research zone, though it doesn't feel like a lab. There are tiny flags, plastic tags, soil probes, and a small weather station humming quietly in the breeze. All of it nestled respectfully into the moss, as if the scientists knew they were guests here. You move closer to a clipboard pinned to a post. The laminated sheet is full of numbers, moisture levels, spore counts, pH readings, timestamps. The kind of data that seems mind-numbingly boring until you realize it's the story of a living carpet. Mainstream science hit. Iceland's moss fields are closely monitored for their role in climate regulation and ecosystem stability. Because moss doesn't just survive in harsh environments, it buffers them. It holds moisture in drought, slows erosion in storms, cools the soil on hot days, and insulates it on cold ones. In a changing climate, moss isn't a bystander. It's a moderator. You walk carefully among the tagged plots, each one marked with little white circles that scientists use to track moss health over time. Some have been in place for over 30 years, meaning someone has returned here every year, crouched in this same position, and whispered politely to the moss with a ruler and thermometer. You find a small bench nearby, simple weathered wood, clearly built for observers who need a break. You sit and read the sign carved into its side. Sit, observe, don't touch. You smile. Fair. From here you can see how the field undulates, gently rising and falling like frozen ocean swells. The fog softens the ridges, turning the entire moss-scape into something dreamlike. You wonder how many generations of moss are layered here. It's not one continuous plant after all. It's a colony, a living quilt woven one strand at a time over centuries. And here's a quirky nugget. Some Icelandic moss colonies are clonal. That is, they reproduce not by seeds, but by simply splitting and continuing to grow, which means some patches are genetically identical to moss that sprouted before the Black Death. You're essentially sitting on a 700-year-old copy-paste. Scientists still argue whether moss fields should be treated like forests or like soil. Are they a landscape, a species, a system, or all three? Definitions blur when you're dealing with something that's both ground and life form. You step away from the bench and head toward a small rise marked with a wooden post. It's not part of the research area. It's older, hand-carved, worn down by weather and time. You brush the moss from the base and discover it's a memorial, a simple one. Just a name, a date, and a line in Icelandic. He sat here every year to hear them grow. You swallow, because now you're hearing it too. No music, no rustling, just that soft ambient presence. The feeling that something is growing, just beneath the surface of your awareness. Something slow, intentional, private. You begin walking again, this time toward the edge of the moss field, where the land dips into a ravine. And you see it, a waterfall spilling gently from a rocky ledge, half hidden by the fog. The sound is muffled, cushioned by distance and moss, but it's unmistakable. Movement, change. The one thing moss never rushes, but always endures. You descend carefully and soon you're at the edge of the fall. A small stream trickles over basalt, collecting in a shallow pool below, surrounded by, what else? Moss. But here the moss is different. Wet, vivid, almost electric in color. It clings to the vertical face of the rock, drinking in the spray, thriving where other plants wouldn't dare. You reach out and touch it. It's colder than the others, but pulsing with life. You sit again, letting the mist coat your face, listening to the waterfall's gentle chatter. And you realize moss doesn't just conquer lava, it elevates it, turns violence into softness, turns endings into beginnings, and all without ever raising its voice. You don't rush to leave the waterfall. There's something magnetic about watching water and moss interact, two forces that move slowly, yet never stop. You sit at the edge, the spray gently misting your face, the moss beneath you, damp but welcoming. The sound of water over stone is constant, not loud, just persistent, like the ticking of a clock that's been running for centuries. Eventually you rise and head back up the slope. You follow a thin footpath, if it can be called that, winding between moss banks so thick you could lose your boot in them. It's not just the visual anymore. It's the feeling of being surrounded by life so soft and patient, it almost feels like time has slowed to match it. At the top of the ridge, the wind returns. It brushes over the moss and over you, cool and clean. And somewhere in the gust, you catch the faintest scent of earth, moisture, and stone. No flowers, no sweetness. just the scent of existence doing its job. And then in the distance, you see movement. Not moss this time, people. Tiny figures near a rope-marked trail, weaving their way between fields of untouched moss. Bright jackets, camera straps. Footsteps just a bit too casual. You wince. You're not judging. You've been there. But now you know what they don't, that every footfall matters here. You walk toward them slowly, sticking to the stone line, keeping your feet on exposed lava like the signs advised. You pass a woman holding her phone high, snapping a panoramic photo. She nods at you, smiles. She doesn't see the crushed patch just behind her. Mainstream science detour. Moss can take decades or even centuries to recover after being stepped on. Some species grow at a rate of only 1 millimeter per year. That means a single footprint can flatten centuries of work. Worse, the moss's internal structure, its capillary network, gets disrupted. It might look fine a week later, but it won't function the same way again. You glance at the damaged area. It's small, easy to miss. But once you notice it, it's like seeing a bent page in a priceless manuscript. You can't unsee it. You kneel beside it. The moss is limp, compressed, no longer springing back. You whisper to it, an apology maybe, or just a promise that you'll be careful. Then you keep moving. Because here's the thing, even when damaged, moss doesn't retaliate. It doesn't wither in protest. It just tries again. It grows, slowly, relentlessly. A quirky example? During a particularly bad volcanic eruption in Iceland in the 18th century, huge moss fields were buried in ash. Entire regions were scorched black. But scientists discovered that beneath the ash, the moss hadn't died. It had gone dormant. And decades later, it reemerged, green, alive, patient. You walk further along the ridge now, away from the groups, away from the signs. The land here is quieter again, the moss thicker. You pause by a stone cairn, an old marker for travelers piled long ago. It's covered in lichen and dusted with moss, a collaboration between organisms that never signed a contract but somehow agreed to share. You rest your hand on the stone, feeling its cool surface, its slow erosion, its silent agreement with the world around it. You realize this rock has likely been here for thousands of years, and in that time the moss made it gentler. Scientists still debate whether moss actually helps break down rock or whether it merely takes advantage of existing cracks. Either way, the result is the same. Over centuries, moss-covered lava becomes soil, and soil becomes the canvas for everything else. Trees, rivers, villages, even regrets. You head down a narrow slope where a small brook trickles through a split in the stone. Moss grows on both sides, framing the water like a velvet ribbon. You kneel, cup your hands, and sip. It's cold, mineral-rich, and filtered likely through miles of moss. That's right, moss isn't just a sponge. It's a natural water filter. It traps sediment, absorbs toxins, and even removes heavy metals from groundwater. In some countries, moss is used in eco-filtration systems and even as an indicator species for air quality. If the moss is thriving, chances are the environment is too. You lean back on your elbows beside the brook, eyes closed, letting the sun rest on your face. And for a moment you feel something rare. Not just peace, not just silence, but continuity. You are one breath in a long line of weather, footsteps, and spore clouds. One observer in a field that does not demand attention, but rewards it. You open your eyes and the world is still green, still growing, still waiting for someone to notice. And now you have. You rise again, legs a little stiff from sitting so long, but mind quiet, like a chalkboard gently wiped clean. The moss sways lightly in the breeze if it moves at all. It's hard to tell. Moss isn't here for theatrics. It's here for the long game. You decide to circle back toward the trailhead, not because you want to leave, but because you feel like the moss is done speaking for today. You've heard what it needed to say. But then, just a few steps later, it says one more thing. You stop at the edge of a shallow ravine and notice a sign, handwritten, weathered. It says, "Do not step here. This moss is over 900 years old." You stare at it, 900, a number usually reserved for castles or cathedrals or monks' illuminated manuscripts. And here it is, describing a plant, a carpet, a thing most people would brush aside on a hiking boot. Mainstream science pause. Some mosses in Iceland have been dated using radiocarbon methods, and a few colonies are confirmed to be over 900 years old. That means this patch may have been alive, growing, when Leif Erikson was still considered recent news. It's one of the few living things on Earth that can claim a lineage like that without having bark or bones. You crouch low and look at the patch. It doesn't look special, not really. It's maybe ankle high, a little lumpy, a bit darker than its neighbors, but it's there, surviving through volcanic ash, wind erosion, grazing sheep, and now, camera-wielding tourists. You feel a strange guilt. The kind of guilt you feel when you realize you've been walking over something sacred without knowing. And here's a quirky parallel. In Japan, certain ancient moss gardens are so revered that people build walkways over them, not for beauty, but for protection. And the monks who tend them, they often describe moss as a living timeline, a memory that grows. You nod slowly. It's the same here, just colder. You continue walking and pass a group of school children with bright coats and muffled giggles. Their teacher is pointing at a laminated diagram of Icelandic moss, explaining something about spores and growth cycles. The kids look politely confused. One leans down and pokes the moss gently with a gloved finger. You smile, that's how it starts. You think about how odd it is that moss, of all things, is finally having its moment. Featured in climate studies, trending in urban landscaping, even popping up in boutique skincare routines as hydration-enhancing moss extract, which you imagine makes your face feel like a foggy hill. Scientists still argue whether moss deserves more conservation attention. Some say it's too slow to matter in modern restoration. Others believe that ignoring moss is like skipping the prelude of a symphony. It's quiet, yes, but without it, the melody collapses. You walk past a large boulder now completely encased in moss. No stone visible, just a rounded green cushion that looks more like a loaf of bread than geology. You press your hand to its side. It's cool. It gives slightly under pressure and then returns. It always returns. The moss doesn't resist. It recovers. You stop to rest beneath a stunted birch tree, the kind that only grows a few feet tall here, its trunk twisted by wind, its branches feathered with lichen. Beneath it, the moss forms a deep, undisturbed basin. You sit in it like a beanbag that's waited just for you. And that's when you feel it again. That sense that this isn't just scenery. This is witness. This moss has outlived empires. It has watched glaciers arrive and retreat. It has grown through silence, through darkness, through ash. And now it's holding you gently, like a parent who's too tired to explain, but still glad you came home. You close your eyes, and you think not about big things, not about climate change or time or spores. You think about stillness, how rare it is, how undeserved, yet generously offered by things that expect nothing in return. You stay there, in that moss cradle, until the light begins to fade again. And the field, the rock, the hill, all of it blurs into softness. You rise one more time. And this time, when you walk, you're part of it. Not above, not separate, just a single soft step in a very long, very green story. The walk back is quieter than before, not because the land has changed, but because you have. Your footsteps land differently now, not lighter, but more aware. The moss doesn't flinch, but you still try to avoid stepping on the thickest patches. It feels personal now. You pause near a stream, this one shallower than the last, more of a trickle between rocks. The moss here grows right up to the water's edge, softening every hard line, every sharp edge. It's like it's negotiating with the landscape, saying, let's be kind to each other. You sit beside it and think about everything this plant has survived and everything it's been part of. You remember reading that moss predates most of the things we associate with Earth. Trees? Moss came first. Dinosaurs? Moss was already here. It colonized the land when life was still figuring out how to breathe air without gills. Mainstream science reminder: mosses are some of the earliest land plants, appearing around 470 million years ago. Their arrival helped trap carbon dioxide and cool the planet, possibly even contributing to Earth's first major ice age. That's right. Moss may have jump-started global cooling before it was trendy. You laugh softly at the thought. Climate influencer, moss. You reach out and dip your fingers in the stream, then gently press them into a moss pad. The water transfers instantly. No resistance, no runoff, just absorption. It's like the moss accepts anything offered, holds it without complaint, then passes it along when needed. You think of conversations with people who do that, and you suddenly admire moss even more. A quirky side note: there's a movement among architects and designers to incorporate moss walls into buildings, not just for looks, but for air purification, humidity control, and even noise reduction. Moss is low maintenance, needs no soil, and thrives in indirect light. In offices, it brings silence to a noisy world. In hospitals, it calms patients. In bedrooms, it whispers sleep. You close your eyes, not to nap, just to be. And that's when you feel something shift. Not in you, but around you. The breeze dies, the stream quiets, and the moss, it feels closer, as if the entire field has drawn in slightly, not threatening, not urgent, just aware. You open your eyes slowly, and in that moment, you understand the phrase scientists sometimes use for moss: the quiet engineer. Moss isn't loud, but it changes everything it touches, slowly, permanently. It alters pH, holds water, cools soil, traps dust, buffers noise, filters air, builds ecosystems one fragment at a time. You stand and begin to follow the stream back toward the ridge, where the moss climbs over rock like green lava flowing in reverse. You wonder how long it took to get there. You wonder if it even remembers. Scientists still debate whether moss can be considered intelligent. Not in the traditional sense, but in its responses, how it tracks light, avoids dryness, even prioritizes certain areas for growth. Is it reflex, or is it intention? You walk on and pass a patch of moss that seems to grow in the exact shape of the shadow cast by a rock, as if it knows the light will always fall there, as if it prefers a little protection. You squint. Coincidence, or moss being clever? You're not sure anymore, and that's kind of wonderful. You reach a field of cushioned moss, a dense, bouncy variety that looks like someone inflated it. You step carefully between the mounds, and each one gives slightly, then rebounds with soft resilience. You picture the spores that helped build it, released into the wind, carried by air, scattered into cracks, and now, here. a colony, a cushion, a legacy. You pause again, because this field, this moss, none of it rushed. It grew with patience. And that's something modern life doesn't reward. You think of your to-do list, your inbox, your pinging phone. You think of how much happens in a week and how moss would laugh at that, if it could laugh. More likely, it would just exist quietly until everything calmed down again. You reach a rock near the trail and sit for a moment, watching the sun drift low on the horizon. The sky is now brushed with soft pastels, peach, lilac, soft slate blue. The moss glows faintly in the light, catching gold in its tiny hairs. It looks like it's exhaling color. And you remember something someone once said about moss. It's the opposite of ambition, and yet it still wins. You nod, then lie back one more time and let the moss hold you. Again, you wake from a brief doze, not the kind where you dream or twitch or jolt, but the kind of rest that just happens. Like moss itself, it sneaks in without fanfare and quietly rewires your entire nervous system. The rock beneath your back is still warm, the moss beneath your head, cool and forgiving. Above you, the sky has deepened to a richer blue, the kind that signals evening without hurrying it along. You sit up slowly, brushing bits of green from your jacket, not in annoyance, but with care, like you're returning something borrowed. You glance downhill and see a gravel path snaking gently through the landscape. And to the side of it, just beyond the curve, you notice a small fenced-off area. Curious, you head toward it. The fence is simple. Wood slats, maybe waist-high, clearly not meant to keep animals out. It's for people. And inside the enclosure, there's more moss. But different, older, thicker. It rolls in strange formations, curled and folded like blankets that were halfway folded and then left behind by someone in a hurry a few centuries ago. A small sign hangs on the fence. You read it slowly. This moss has not been stepped on in over 400 years. Please help keep it that way. You blink. 4 centuries. Mainstream science reality check. Mosses have no protective bark, no vascular healing system, and no defense mechanisms beyond being slightly squishy and low to the ground. When they're crushed, they don't bounce back like turf grass. They die back slowly, or go dormant. And then if undisturbed for long enough, maybe, just maybe, they return. You stand there a while, hands resting on the fence, as if you're visiting an elderly relative. The moss inside looks like something out of a fantasy novel. Pillowy, untouched, deeply green, no cigarette butts, no snack wrappers, no boot prints, just the gentle passage of time. And you can't help but think, this is what untouched looks like. This is what the world does when we don't interfere. You take a photo, not for social media, just to remember. You don't even look at the screen. You just hit the shutter and put the phone away. A few feet down the trail, there's a bench. This one newer than the last, built of treated wood, curved for comfort. You sit and exhale. From here, you can see the moss field stretch out in every direction, rolling, rippling, softening the lava that once exploded with fire and ash, now covered in green quiet, green patience, a quirky historical footnote. After major eruptions like Laki in 1783, much of southern Iceland was devastated. Farmland ruined, rivers poisoned, livestock gone. But in the years that followed, moss was the first to return. Locals called it green hope, not because it was fast, but because it showed up when nothing else did. You stare at the landscape and feel that phrase settle into your chest. Green hope. Not loud, not flashy, but real. Scientists still debate how much moss should be preserved versus used. Some see it as a symbol, important but replaceable. Others argue that moss fields are irreplaceable bioarchives, living records of climate, pollution, and environmental history. A single core sample from a moss bed can reveal centuries of air quality, like tree rings, but softer, less dramatic, and way more absorbent. You rise from the bench and continue walking. As you crest a ridge, the trail opens up to a panoramic view. Lava plains, soft hills, distant glacial tongues spilling from the horizon like frozen rivers. And there, anchoring it all, is the moss, the quiet conqueror. You step off the gravel trail, carefully onto an exposed patch of rock, and stand there for a long moment. And something clicks. You realize that this whole time, you've been watching moss like it's scenery. But really, you're the visitor. Moss doesn't need us. It doesn't depend on us. It isn't cultivated or farmed or coaxed into bloom. It simply grows where it can, when it can, and for as long as it takes. You crouch, run your hand gently over a patch beside you, and whisper, not to the moss, but to yourself. More of this, more slowness, more silence, more life that doesn't ask for attention but gets it anyway. Eventually, you stand again. The air smells like stone and time, and moss, and home. You're walking again, the sky beginning to stretch into its longer colors. Those soft purples and molten ambers that tell you time is moving, but there's no need to chase it. The path rolls gently down into a valley now, and the moss thickens again, as if it too prefers lower ground where water lingers and wind loses interest. Here the moss is impossibly dense. You stop and press your foot gently on a thick pad. It swallows your boot halfway. You pull back, feeling like you just stepped into a pudding made of clouds and ancient patience. And then you see something that makes you stop. It's not a rock. It's not a sheep. It's a structure. Small, rounded, almost sunken. You walk closer and realize it's an old turf house, or rather what remains of one. A moss-covered dome of stone and sod, partially caved in, blending so perfectly into the hillside, it would disappear completely if not for the faint, arched doorway. No sign, no rope, just there, waiting. You crouch to look inside. It's dark, musty, the smell of earth and moss, of course. The walls are lined with turf blocks, and every one of them is green, not just with age, but with living moss. It crept in, as it always does, first as a visitor, then as a decorator, then as the new tenant. You sit at the threshold, just outside. The doorway frames the landscape in a way that feels like a painting. Moss on moss, with a dash of sky. Mainstream fact moment. Turf houses were common in Iceland for centuries. Built with stacked lava stones and blocks of earth, insulated by layers of moss and grass. They were warm, efficient, and sustainable. Moss was used not only for insulation, but for stitching the seams of the house together, literally growing into cracks to bind it tighter. You touch the walls. The moss is thriving. It's likely been growing here since before the house collapsed, maybe before it was even built. And here's a quirky detail. In some Icelandic turf houses, moss was used to listen to weather. If it grew faster on the north side, storms were coming. If it dried suddenly, a frost was likely. Moss was a kind of green barometer, soft science before science had lab coats. You lean back against the doorway and close your eyes for a moment, and you imagine the people who lived here, what they felt, what they feared, what they leaned on to keep warm, to stay safe. Fire, yes. Family, yes. But also, moss. You open your eyes and notice something curious. The edges of the turf wall are being reabsorbed by the earth. The line between built and natural has blurred. The moss doesn't care if it's growing on rock or roof. It treats both the same. It covers what's left, tucks it in, and keeps growing. Scientists still argue whether structures like these should be preserved or allowed to decompose naturally. Is it more respectful to rebuild, or let the land reclaim what's already halfway home? Iceland leans toward balance. Some turf homes are restored, some are left to the moss. You stand again and continue walking. The valley deepening around you, the wind now almost still. And then, as you round a corner, you find something small and modern. A glass dome. Not a house, not an observatory, but something stranger, a moss terrarium. Inside the dome is a patch of carefully cultivated Icelandic moss. Raised on sterilized lava rocks, misted by a tiny spray system, monitored by sensors. It's part of an experiment. A laminated card nearby explains, monitoring moss growth under simulated Martian conditions. You blink. Martian. Of course. Mainstream science check-in. Moss has recently become a subject of interest in astrobiology. Why? Because it's resilient. It can survive desiccation, radiation, cold and poor soil. Researchers have tested mosses on the International Space Station and inside Mars simulation chambers to study whether moss could help terraform or support long-term life support systems. You kneel and look through the glass. The moss inside is smaller than the wild patches you've been walking across, but no less determined. It's already taken hold of the lava substrate. Tiny threads crawl outward like green explorers, and you suddenly realize moss might outlive us, outlive our buildings, our tech, our headlines. It might colonize Mars before we do. You step back from the dome and look around at the valley, back at the turf house, at the endless ripple of moss fields stretching into shadow, and it dawns on you that this isn't just a plant. It's a philosophy. Grow where you can. Hold what matters. Let go when it's time. You start walking again, slower now, quieter, because you're no longer just observing moss. You're listening to it. The trail narrows again as you reach the final stretch. Though trail feels too intentional a word, it's more of a suggestion, a line of slightly less moss between patches of very insistent moss. You follow it because there's nowhere else you'd rather step. Not anymore. The sun is low now, dragging golden light across the field. Everything glows, not in a dramatic postcard kind of way, but like the land has just remembered it's been alive all day and finally wants to be seen. You pause at the edge of a rise, overlooking the Moss Valley one last time, and you feel it. That strange mix of reverence and insignificance, like standing in a cathedral made of silence. You realize how much space this moss has covered, not just in a distance, but in time. It's outlasted civilizations, witnessed eruptions, sheltered birds and bugs and sheep hooves, maybe even a lost sock or two. You sit down again, one last sit. The moss below is damp from the day, cool from the evening air. It adjusts slightly to your shape, and you wonder how many others it has held. Travelers, scientists, locals, dreamers. You run your fingers across the surface and think about everything this moss has seen. No eyes, no brain, and still it has memory. Layered in its growth are centuries of dust, pollen, ash, and rain, carbon from old fire, iron from distant soil, molecules exhaled by people you'll never meet. Everything is here. Nothing is wasted. Mainstream fact moment. Moss doesn't decay quickly. It accumulates. Over time, dead layers compress beneath living ones, forming peat in some places or dense mats in others. These layers can trap historical data, like tree rings, but squishier. Researchers study moss strata to reconstruct climate patterns, volcanic events, and even air pollution over centuries. You lie back and close your eyes. The sky above is violet now, with streaks of peach along the horizon. A few stars blink awake. Somewhere far away, a bird calls once, then stops. The wind has settled, and so have you. Scientists still debate what exactly makes moss such an effective survivor. Some point to its ability to desiccate, to dry out almost completely, then return to life with a single misting. Others suggest it's simply its lack of ambition. It doesn't try to outgrow the world. It just fits into it. A quirky parting thought. In the Victorian era, people used to collect moss in moss gardens, tiny glass domes where moss grew in carefully curated stillness. These were prized not for their color or bloom, but for their slowness, a kind of living hourglass, a plant you couldn't rush and wouldn't want to. You open your eyes, and it's still here. The moss, the air, the hush. You sit up slower this time, not because you're tired, but because it feels wrong to leave quickly. You brush your hand across the moss once more and whisper, not a goodbye, just a thanks. The trail winds upward toward a small wooden gate. Beyond it, the world resumes. Parking lots, signs, asphalt. But before you cross that invisible line, you stop. Turn back. One last look. The moss field stretches behind you like a memory made physical. Still, strong, silly in its softness, sacred in its resilience. And then you step through the gate. The air changes. The sounds return. But something inside you stays green, soft, steady, quiet. The trail is gone now, but the moss isn't. It lingers, not under your feet anymore, but in your thoughts. A quiet weight, a gentle voice, not saying anything urgent, just waiting, like it always has. You ease into your bed the same way you stepped onto the moss, slowly, softly, with more awareness than usual. Your body sinks into the mattress, not unlike your boots once did, and you let gravity hold you, the way the moss held your shape without protest. Outside, the world continues. Lights flicker in windows. Cars hum down roads. Someone is arguing somewhere. But here, in this room, it's moss time now. So let everything else fall away. The to-do lists, the screens, the noise. Picture that moss field again. The way it glowed in the evening light. The way it held centuries without needing to be noticed. Remember the stillness beneath your steps, the softness beneath your spine, the way the air got quieter the longer you stayed. Let your breath slow to match the moss's rhythm. Lastlong, shallow, patient. The day is done, the fire is out, and the green has won without raising its voice. Let yourself be held by that quiet now, by softness, by something older than language, older than worry, older than sleep. Good night.